All right. Well, we hope everybody is comfortable. Welcome. We are excited that you have joined us for the Pediatric Clinical Trials 101, what they are and how to participate. So today is obviously September 19th, and we are so excited because it is Pain Awareness Month for us all month long. So we've had a lot of different activities that have been going on. So couple housekeeping things. Pain Awareness Month, understanding what clinical trials, and Q&A is kind of the outline of how the night is going to go. It's going to be a quick hour for us. Tonight's webinar is in collaboration with CHAMP and their program Migraine at School. So Susan, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and CHAMP and Migraine at School.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Thanks for having us here tonight. I'm Susan Dowdy. I'm the Interim Executive Director of CHAMP. Migraine at School is a program of CHAMP. CHAMP is the Coalition for Headache and Migraine Patients. We run Migraine at School in partnership with the Danielle Byron Henry Foundation. This program is dedicated to breaking down the barriers that children with migraine disease face in their education journey. We know that there are millions of young students across the country who have migraine. It's often misunderstood, underdiagnosed, and stigmatized. We would love for you to learn more about CHAMP by visiting headachemigraine.org and Migraine at School at migraineatschool.org.
Fantastic. As well as in collaboration with Miles for Migraine. And Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sarah Rathsack with Miles for Migraine. If you guys don't know what Miles for Migraine is, it's a nonprofit organization that connects migraine and headache community with in-person walks, online support groups, an advocacy program, and education events like tonight's. We're always happy to be collaborating with the U.S. Pain's Pediatric Pain Warrior Program and Migraine at School to try and help as many families as possible. So thank you all for coming tonight.
Well, welcome to both of you guys and to everybody else who is here. My name is Casey Cashman. I am the director of the Pediatric Pain Warrior Program here at U.S. Pain Foundation. The pediatric program through the U.S. Pain Foundation really focuses on helping children and their families through education, through our to help them feel empowered, educate. My gosh, I'm totally just confusing everything right now. We really work on empowering, educating, supporting, and empowering, educating, supporting, and providing community for the pain patients. And we do that through several different programs. So some housekeeping that we have here for this evening. This webinar is educational only. U.S. Pain Foundation, Miles for Migraine, and Migraine at School do not recommend or endorse one treatment, therapy, or product. Questions will be taken at the end. To ask a question on Zoom, type the question into the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. If you are watching us on Facebook, welcome. Type the question into the comments, and we have somebody monitoring them there, and we will get your questions asked there. But please keep your questions on topic, and the webinar is being recorded and will be posted at a later date. So this month, like I said, is Pain Awareness Month. So just so you guys know, the theme for the month is research pain and manage pain, #pain trials. For more information, you guys can go to uspainfoundation.org/pain awareness month. The theme, it highlights the need for more pain research to improve outcome for millions of Americans. Some different things that we have done this month already and are continuing to do are daily social media posts highlighting a different fact or statistic, weekly articles focusing on pain research, infographics on understanding clinical trials, 3 webinars, including prominent NIH researchers. I mean, there might be one on clinical trial experts and an individuals with pain. 4 health hack video events, incorporating researchers into our support groups, and then 2 in-person patient education events at Humana Neighborhood Center locations in Las Vegas. So now, without any further ado, we're going to introduce our guest speaker and the reason that you guys are all here tonight. So Richard Town is a licensed pharmacist and doctor of pharmacy. He leads the annotation team at Antidote. He's responsible for structuring the inclusion and exclusion criteria of currently available trials on clinicaltrials.gov in order to maximize patient matching through Antidote Match. He hosts the Talk of the Town podcast and centers on talking to representatives of different patient advocacy groups about the challenges facing clinical trials and how patients, sponsors, and other groups can help to address them. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And then, Richard, if you want to go ahead, I think you can start sharing. And welcome, everyone.
Yeah, welcome, everyone. Can't wait to get this started. All right, can you see my screen? Well, loading. Now you should be able to see my screen.
Yes.
Awesome. And let me just minimize that. All right, that should be totally visible. Let's see. All right, does that look good? Perfect. So hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Really honored to be here. This webinar is Pediatric Clinical Trials 101, what they are and how to participate. And I've already been introduced. I'm the Senior Clinical Informatics Manager at Antidote.me. So we really started off with what I do at Antidote, but just for a little bit of background, I went to the UB School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences, and then graduated with my doctorate in pharmacy. So what that really does is, when most people think of pharmacy, they think of going to get pills picked up. They think of, Rite Aid, CVS, Walgreens. And actually, pharmacists do a whole lot in the healthcare field. And I was lucky enough to work all sorts of places. I worked at a children's hospital in the general medicine floor and also focused on the cancer floor. I worked at a primary care, or sort of like a general practitioner's office for both adult and pediatric patients. I worked at an insurance company, and I also worked at a clinical trial site briefly. And when I first went to that clinical trial site, I realized what an unmet need there was in terms of recruitment for clinical trials. And Casey really touched on it, that there's so many people living with pain conditions and so many people living with a lot of conditions. And I was really interested on how innovation and development happen for those areas. So at Antidote, my chief responsibility, and I'll get into it a little bit more later when we actually go through a sample clinical trial journey, is making sure that every material that we put out is patient-friendly. We really want to take a patient-centric first attitude, because Antidote is all about connecting patients with clinical trials, no matter where they may be or what conditions they may have. And just in that vein, I'm really interested in making sure that everyone is able to learn about and engage with clinical trials. So the big question, what is a clinical trial? It's a term that's thrown around a lot, but hopefully in this presentation, I can give you a little bit more background as to what a clinical trial is, who participates, who's involved, and so on and so forth. Here is the verbatim definition from the National Institute of Health, or the NIH, and it reads, a research study in which one or more human subjects are assigned to one or more treatments, which may include placebo or other control, to evaluate the effects of those treatments and health-related outcomes. So that's the sort of jargony, formal way. Basically, what that means is you hold a clinical trial when you want to assess a treatment, whether that's a device, a drug, a procedure, and then you want to see how well that works and how safe it is compared to something else. So more often than not, we think of the placebo or the sugar pill, but that's not actually the only thing that's measured against in a clinical trial. For certain conditions, you'll actually measure it against maybe other therapies on the market, maybe other procedures or other devices, just to make sure that this new treatment is maybe more effective and just as safe or more safe or vice versa. So not always just a sugar pill, but what a clinical trial is all about is really evaluating how well this new treatment works against existing treatments or just by itself. So I always find this really interesting looking at the history of clinical trials. It goes all the way back to 1747 and James Lind right there, researching a treatment for scurvy. He was sailing abroad and they hadn't had a lot of fresh fruit for months. And a lot of the sailors actually came down with scurvy, which is what we know now as vitamin C deficiency. So he had the idea that there were all these things on the ship and he wanted to give every single sailor something different and see what works. And they ended up finding that oranges, due to all the vitamin C in them, were great at preventing and treating scurvy. Now, if we jump forward more than 100 years here, the first researcher, Austin Flint, decided to use a placebo, like I mentioned, that sugar pill, because he wanted to see, is what I'm studying more effective than if the patients think they're taking something? Because there's such a thing known as a placebo effect. And the placebo effect is where just by thinking you're getting the treatment, you're having a really positive or negative effect to it. And that's something that we want to make sure isn't present when a drug gets approved, because you want to make sure it's more effective than just thinking you're getting something. Now, if we jump forward almost another 100 years, and you can see that there's not that much that changes in between these dates. Lots going on in the world, not that much going on in clinical trials. So in 1946, the first randomized controlled trial took place. So with a randomized controlled trial, before in these previous two treatments, everyone knew what they were going to get. So, and what happens when the trial isn't randomized is the researchers know what treatment people are going to get, and maybe they'd start treating people a little bit differently when they knew what they got. So if they knew they got a placebo, maybe they'd try just a little bit harder to treat them, and that kind of gave it away to the patients. So in 1946, this randomized controlled trial, that allowed researchers to kind of decide, it kind of helped define the placebo effect a little bit more, because nobody knew what they were going to get. Now, this time it's getting a lot sooner here with the change, 1960s, 1970s. The FDA, or Food and Drug Administration, up until this point, the only thing that a clinical trial needed to assess was if the treatment actually worked. It wasn't really a consideration until we started seeing some side effects that the FDA started requiring that clinical trials not only had to prove that a new drug, device, or procedure is safe, but they had to also, not only prove that it's effective, but now you also had to prove that it was safe. So you can't get your drug approved by the market if your new thing was not safe, as determined by the clinical trial. So now all the way in 1997, as with the advent of the internet, the FDA Modernization Act, which is where they really tried to update their policies and procedures, they introduced clinicaltrials.gov, which we'll get into later, as sort of a central repository for all clinical trials. And clinicaltrials.gov has a lot of weaknesses, and we'll get into them later. But in 2021, the NIH and the other agencies involved in the maintenance of clinicaltrials.gov, they introduced a new version of clinicaltrials.gov that made it a little bit more patient-friendly in a beta format. And in 2023, so earlier this year, the new version of clinicaltrials.gov was introduced to the public. So, as I mentioned before, why are these clinical trials conducted? And the official wording, like I said, is used to determine whether new drugs, diagnostics, or treatments are both safe and effective. So you're not really looking for one or the other. You need to prove that it could be safe, but it's not going to be approved if it's not effective. And even if it's effective, it's not going to be approved if it's not safe. So the clinical trials really aim to see, are these new things actually both of those? And one of the things I actually forgot to mention, and I will get into this a little bit later as well, is also diagnostics. So tests need to go through clinical trials as well to make sure that they're actually effective at diagnosing a disease, or just picking up maybe a biomarker or something like that for a condition. So here is a much deeper dive into some more specific reasons as to why clinical trials are conducted. So the interventional one that I've already talked about, drugs, medical devices, surgical approaches, radiation therapy for treating a disease, syndrome, or a condition. Another thing is really trying to prevent the initial development or recurrence of a disease or condition. And this is something now where, especially when we think about pain conditions, finding ways that you can prevent the recurrence of pain conditions is so crucial. And that's the goal of a lot of these clinical trials, is in that second bullet. Third one I just talked about, trying to find better ways to diagnose conditions earlier and with more accuracy. This is really something that's big in the cancer space right now, trying to figure out if we can diagnose cancer at earlier stages and potentially give patients treatment before it gets more severe. Another one, once again, trying to identify some risk factors, trying to see that if we can kind of pinpoint certain risk factors to the development of a condition, so that those risk factors can be addressed and potentially the disease is either averted or made much more mild. And lastly, exploring and measuring ways to improve comfort and quality of life through supportive care for people with a chronic illness. So this isn't necessarily always going to be treatment, curing, preventing. Sometimes this is just, lowering the levels of pain, lowering the amount of flares. So that's what they call palliative sort of treatment. So these palliative clinical trials are also a big goal of why clinical trials are conducted. So there are a bunch of different types of clinical trials that an investigator, which is the name for someone that is arranging a clinical trial, can do. So the first one is a feasibility study. And usually this is just done to see if it's possible to do the main study. And if the patients are able to be found and if the actual sort of schedule and dosing and all that works. So once a feasibility study is passed, a pilot study, which is a slightly smaller version of what the main study is, that will be conducted. So if the main study is looking for about 100 patients, maybe the pilot study will only look for 10 just to start off, and making sure that everything really resonates with the patients and that the study can actually be conducted. Prevention trials, that's a specific name for a trial to determine if a particular treatment can help prevent a disease. Screening trials, that's one of those diagnostic trials that I mentioned, testing for earlier signs of disease before they have any symptoms. Observational trials are also something that's really big and sometimes I don't think gets enough attention, where participants with a disease or a certain shared characteristic will just be observed to try to assess their health outcomes. So maybe in something where it's patients with a pain condition, and investigators really want to see different factors that might lead to that patient's condition getting better or worse. And while the patient might not be getting treatment in an observational trial, there's a lot of data that's conducted that can be used to further start trials down the road. And then, of course, the biggest one, which is treatment trials. And I'll get into the different phases of clinical trials later, because that's a really important part of this figuring out how far along a molecule is. But the earlier in these phases, you're really concerned about safety. And then later in the phases, you're really concerned to see if the new treatment is at least as good as what's on the market. So here is a really, really helpful graph from the Lupus Research Alliance that I find helps a lot for describing what the different phases of clinical trials are. So phase one, this is where they have an investigational compound, device, procedure. And this is after animal studies have already been conducted. So this phase one is the first human phase. So the molecule has already passed animal studies, and the company or investigator has a really good idea that this might work. So this phase one is a very small group. We might say about 50 to 100 patients. And this, what they're looking for is evaluating the safety, making sure that there's no serious side effects, determining the actual dosage of the drug that works. When we all get prescriptions or medications, there's a certain dosage next to it. Phase one is really where that determination is. So what dosage is basically the highest dosage that we can give for the maximum effect without causing side effects. And then lastly there, like I said, the safety analysis is the side effects. So deciding those early down the road really helps in later clinical trials, because if certain side effects keep on being an issue, they might discontinue the drug's development or not approve it for the market. And then at the bottom there, you can see about 70% of drugs in phase one make it on to what's called a phase two trial. So now phase two is not just interested in safety, it's also interested in effectiveness. So with this, you actually want to make sure that the drug works and you want to further evaluate the safety. Like I said before, there's certain side effects that might have been a little troublesome in phase 1, but maybe not enough to discontinue the drug. You want to make sure those aren't an issue in phase 2. And this is going to be a slightly bigger group than phase 1. Whereas I mentioned before, phase 1 might be 50 to 100. Phase 2, and this is very dependent on condition, by the way. Ultra rare conditions might only recruit a handful of participants, whereas something as common as migraine might recruit hundreds or thousands of participants. So it's very variable. But anyways, for a phase 2 study, if the phase 1 is 50 to 100 participants, the phase 2 will maybe be something like 150 to 200. So a bigger group. And this is all people with the condition as well. Now, if the drug is one of the 33% of drugs that make it onto the next phase, which is very notable because about 67% of drugs in phase 2, they don't work or they're not effective enough for the FDA to consider passing it along to the next phase. So phase 3, that is the main phase that we think of when we think of a big scale clinical trial. And so the goal of a phase 3 trial is to confirm the effectiveness of the drug. And this is where it's often done against a placebo or standard of care. Monitoring those side effects in a very big group of patients, the size of this population, the previous one was 150 to 300. This one might be 500 to 1,000. So it's a very big group of patients with the condition. And then they're also looking to collect any information they can, and that's done for, just for the approval of the drug. The FDA requires very, very, very in-depth records to approve a drug. And I've heard, it may be dump trucks or just gigabytes and gigabytes of information to approve a drug. And researchers are really, really focused on making sure that they collect that information well. So once again, only about 25 to 30% of drugs move on to the next phase. And it's important to note, if a drug passes a phase 3 trial, it's most often approved by the FDA. So a phase 4 trial in that vein is that after the drug has been approved, this is what's called a long-term monitoring study. And so what happens in a phase 4 is that the investigators will sort of follow patients taking the drug and see if there's any long-term side effects or anything that pop up with the usage of the medication, device, or procedure. And this can really be helpful in sort of deciding if there's any extra risks of the drug, what the benefits are, and how the drug can best be used. And sometimes the instructions will change on the drug, maybe the dosing frequency will change. And occasionally, since the FDA keeps such a close eye, if a drug does have long-term side effects, it is often pulled off of the market. So that's the point of the phase 4. And it's often required for ones that might have a few side effects comparatively to their peer drugs. So now let's actually get into the personnel involved with the clinical trial. So every clinical study is led by a person called a principal investigator, who's often a medical doctor. And the role of the principal investigator is that they lead basically the clinical trial, and they'll make sure that all of the sites and all of the teams, they'll sort of coordinate that. And it's their goal to really take the clinical trial from start to completion. And at the site level, there's also a research team, and this is going to be really dependent on the kind of site by you, because all sorts of facilities can be sites. And that can include doctors, nurses, social workers, and other healthcare professionals, really making sure that patients are cared for, that they have their questions answered, and that they have the best possible experience at the study sites. And obviously, everyone brings their own little piece of expertise to the team. So especially for clinical trials for more complicated conditions or more, maybe a more rigorous study schedule, these clinical study teams really put in the work to make sure that those trials get conducted and that patients are able to make it all the way through. So I just mentioned this, but where are clinical studies held? And there's not just one place to hold a clinical trial. It can happen in many, many locations. And that can be anywhere from a hospital, your local hospital, a big city hospital, and those often have research wings. It can also happen at universities. Sometimes that's more of, there might be an academic, such as a professor, that's maybe holding their own clinical trial or seeing patients for a clinical trial. Doctors' offices, sometimes specialists will have clinical trials that they'll run out of their office, where they'll administer the medication as part of the primary care visit or the specialist visit or so on and so forth. And also community clinics. Basically, anywhere that someone can go to search for care can be a clinical trial site. And we've seen a lot more of these clinical trial site networks where it's actually a building that's only designed for clinical trials. And they've gotten really, really good at recruiting for clinical trials. So we're starting to see those pop up more as locations for sites to be, locations for studies to be conducted at, is these sort of professional sites that all they do is clinical trials. So that's definitely something to keep an eye out for if you see one near you, even if it's not necessarily a more familiar face like a hospital or a university. Now, one of the things is, we talked about how can I match or find a clinical trial? One of the most important parts of a clinical trial is that there are specific requirements for who and who cannot get in. And the factors that allow someone to participate, factors that they must have, are called the inclusion criteria. So in order to participate in a clinical trial, patients must meet all of the inclusion criteria. So what that means is, let's say it's a clinical trial for migraine. Patients must have migraine, and patients must have it this frequently. And this is not for all clinical trials, obviously, they're all different. But hypothetically, in this clinical trial that I've sort of mentioned, the patients would need to meet both those criteria to be considered for inclusion in the study. And now, in addition to the inclusion criteria, there's also factors that disqualify someone from participating called exclusion criteria. And what the goal of exclusion criteria is it's to make sure that patients don't have any conditions that might sort of confuse the results. So for instance, in a clinical trial for migraine, a common exclusion criteria might be a very similar pain-causing condition to migraine. And it's up for debate whether or not these criteria are often, sometimes they're needed, sometimes they're not, sometimes it's really in the opinion of the person running the study. But the goal of the exclusion criteria is that they only want a certain kind of patient, and the exclusion criteria really help to refine the patient that enters the study to be a very, very specific type so that their drug can be studied against it and they can get the best data possible. And like I just mentioned, inclusion and exclusion criteria are based on characteristics such as age, gender, the type and stage of a disease, especially for cancer. Stage is the predominant way that a lot of cancer studies have their inclusion exclusion criteria. Previous treatment history is really critical because for certain different clinical trials, they want to see patients at different lines of condition. So there's such a thing as called a first line condition, where the clinical trial would be the first time the patient has ever received therapy. So a patient ideally in this world would join the clinical trial before they've received anything else to see if this drug is better than what is most often used for the first treatment of that condition. And then there's also other medical conditions that are inclusion exclusionary. And usually, you have to have the condition that the trial is being studied in. And you don't want a lot of comorbidities that, like I said, might either make the trial unsafe for the patient or might potentially kind of obscure the data if the condition is very similar to the condition under study. So another big thing that came up during COVID and is commonly a topic, and it's a very important one. And obviously I advocate everyone to ask these kind of questions about how they're protected during clinical trials. But the process in which people are protected during clinical trials is called the informed consent process. And so as part of the informed consent process, researchers will give patients information about a clinical trial, the type of drug they're going to use, the schedule of the visit, what they're looking for, potential side effects that may have been caused by the drug. So basically giving potential participants all the information about the study before they join to help people decide if it's a good fit for them. The only way that a patient will be receiving the study drug is if they provide their informed consent. And in a pediatric sense, usually the caregiver will give the informed consent, and the pediatric patient, they will give something called informed assent, which is that they are okay with it. It's not as in-depth as the informed consent form, but once again, the drug will not be administered if the patient, even if they're pediatric, does not assent to the actual participation in that trial. And the real goal of this is it's done through something called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. And that's a group that will actually make sure that everything done in the study is ethical. They review all the procedures, the dosing schedule, the use or not the use of a placebo, And they'll sort of review everything to make sure that a clinical trial is conducted ethically and meets something called GCP, which is Good Clinical Practice Guidelines. And this is really, really important for anyone that's interested in clinical trials, is to make sure that you're reading the informed consent form, make sure that you're reading the informed assent form, and understand all the risks, but potential benefits, and then alternatives to this study. I think something really critical here is, as part of the clinical trial, they will often tell you what your alternative is to participating in the clinical trial. So more often than not, the clinical trial can be the best option because they're looking at something new. But during this informed consent process, they will talk about the potential alternatives to participating in a clinical trial outside of actually participating in the clinical trial.
Richard,
Yes.
can I just ask a quick, so we got a question that was just typed in.
Yes.
So it says, does the FDA require all treatments that make it to the market to have a phase 4 study? If not, how do they decide which treatments need to do this study?
That's a really, really good question. So whoever asked that, thank you for mentioning that. I'll come back to the phase 4 here. So the FDA does not currently require all companies to do this. It's strongly, strongly recommended, especially because more often than not, a lot of the newer therapies, companies by themselves are trying to look for any advantage that they can get. They want to make sure, they want to prove that their drug is safe. So they will be conducting this phase 4 study usually on their own. But the most common flag for the FDA to require a phase 4 study is serious adverse effects that show up in the clinical trial. So there are some serious long-term effects that, maybe were hinted at in phase 2 and phase 3. That's when the FDA will definitely be a lot more stringent on these post-marketing requirements. So there's not a one size fits all, but yeah, most companies will just do the phase 4 because they want the data for themselves. And it's also important to know that even in the absence of an official phase 4 study, adverse effects are collected in the background. There is an adverse event reporting form for most approved drugs. And with that, the data might be collected, just not in a formalized basis. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I'm not sure if we have any other questions, Casey.
No, not right now. And Rebecca, I don't think we have any on Facebook, right?
Not yet. Nope.
Perfect.
Okay.
Well, then let me skip ahead to how can I find about clinical trials for my child or myself? So that's one of the goals here, is we wanted to talk about the best way to actually find out and connect with research. So I'm actually going to stop sharing this screen. And it's really helpful that there's 2 places that you can look online, clinicaltrials.gov, and I'll also show the example of the antidote widget on the US Pain Foundation website. Another key thing, just to put it out there, is also just discuss with a healthcare provider or specialist, because there might be a clinical trial that they're conducting or that's being conducted really close to you. And the provider might know about it. They'll actually be able to know a little bit more about your condition and whether or not you're a good fit. So definitely make sure to involve them in this, because they're definitely something where you want to make sure that you're making the best decision for you. And I'd say more often than not, clinical trials definitely are an option for everyone, but it's definitely good to loop your treatment team in as well, see what they think and if they have any suggestions. So I'll go first to clinicaltrials.gov. Can you see the clinicaltrials.gov screen?
Yes.
So this is what clinicaltrials.gov looks like. And you can see that this is an official website of the United States government, sponsored by the NIH. And it does pretty much what it says. Clinicaltrials.gov is a place to learn about clinical studies from around the world. And so when a company or a sponsor, an investigator, or anyone wants to hold a clinical trial, they have to put it up on clinicaltrials.gov so that everyone can review it and potentially, contact them for participation. So the first thing you see is you're going to see this focus your search button. There's a couple of boxes here that I'll walk through one by one. The first is the condition or the disease. I put migraine because, that's the condition we're most interested in tonight. There's also other terms, and this is where you can put anything from the drug that you're interested in, if it's being studied. You can put the name of the company, And you can put really any keyword that you're interested in here. I won't for the sake of this, but definitely something I'll use often if I'm trying to see what a specific company or a specific drug is doing and what clinical trials are being held around it. I've also got the intervention or the treatment, like the above. Both of them really work, but this field is specifically going to search the intervention or the treatment. Now you've got the location, and you're going to type your location in here, and it's going to pop up a radius. I live in Buffalo, New York, so this is going to be set to Buffalo, New York right now within a 50-mile radius. Hopefully there is some migraine trials. Otherwise, I can expand the radius as needed. And one of the really important things that I'd like to let you know is to hit this recruiting and not yet recruiting studies button. All studies includes every single study that's ever been done in clinicaltrials.gov in that condition. So all in all, this might be hundreds, if not thousands of trials. If you're looking for a clinical trial to participate in, definitely click this recruiting and not yet recruiting studies button. So we go to more filters. We can now be a little bit more specific here as to what we're looking for. We've got sex. Right now, this is something that the FDA is working on updating to be gender, but that is something that they're still trying to figure out the best approach to doing. We got a question about that last year, which was a really good question. And once again, with sex and gender, very important to contact the study site in regards to that. If you have any concerns about potential gender misgendering or anything like that, really important to just reach out to the study site ahead of time and explain things to the site so you know that they're informed and they'll be able to give you better information before you spend time going there. So happy to answer questions on that later, by the way. But second one is we have these age buckets for the purpose of this pediatric pain wars, and we will do child, which is birth to 17. You can actually do multiple buckets here as well if you're interested. But for right now, we will just hold one. And you can actually get really specific as well if you only want to find one specific age range. We can also do accepts healthy volunteers. And that's if you're a healthy volunteer, maybe looking to participate. There's a lot of people do that because phase 1 trials do primarily recruit healthy volunteers. That's something that I forgot to mention because phase 1 is all about that safety. So they want to make sure that it's healthy volunteers who are able to receive the drug safely. So if you're interested in that, you can tap that yes button. I'm not going to click that right now. We already went through the phases. You can click the phases of clinical trials that you're interested in right here. Usually, I would suggest not clicking on, but if you're more comfortable with drugs that are in the maybe phase 3 or phase 4, you can highlight by that. We talked about the study type, interventional, you're receiving a treatment, observational, that is being collected, patient registries. A patient registry is something where a certain organization is actually collecting patients in preparation for a clinical trial that might happen down the road, or maybe the release of a new drug. Basically, it's trying to build up a list of patients. And this is also often kind of a subset of observational studies where they want to get a really large group of patients with a condition to try to observe trends and patterns in them as well. Expanded access, that's a really rare one. I haven't actually run into that many expanded access programs, but expanded access is sort of like patients being able to receive an investigational drug, open label, so they'll know what they're getting. This one's definitely not as common here. Study results, that's just if you're looking at historical studies, you can also look up the historical treatment studies and you can see the results here. This is where we're not as interested. This is study documentation. Usually this is going to be more on the government side looking for this. Funder type is who is actually paying for the trial. The NIH, another US federal agency, industry, which is pharmaceutical companies, and then all others, individuals, universities, and organizations. Date range, you can sort of look at when you want the study start. I don't think this is necessarily that important right now. Primary completion, when the study is actually going to be completed. First posted, when it went to the website. Results first posted, when the results were first posted. Last update, study completion. And then there's a lot more ways to search. And you can do all these in the other terms all the way up here. So you don't need to really go at the bottom here. And so now we're going to click search. So this is with migraine studies for pediatric patients within 15 miles of my location in Buffalo, New York. And so this is what you're going to see. You're going to see all these individual studies that are either recruiting or not yet recruiting. And one of the tough things about this is sometimes it's very tough to tell what these studies are actually looking for. But just for the sake of kind of walking you through what the study results page is, we will click one. So this is the efficacy and safety study. This is just the first one I picked. No affiliation whatsoever. Don't suggest joining this particular clinical trial. But basically, if you look at this, you can see the locations that this trial is being held. You can see that there's a study site in Amherst. These participation criteria, and these are the inclusion-exclusion criteria that I talked about before, where for this particular clinical trial, they're looking for people that are at least 6 to 17 years old. They have a 6-month history of migraine with all of these specific criteria. And the exclusion criteria are as below. And then you can see a couple more information on what the study is actually, how it's designed, who's sponsoring it, and any other information that might be useful. So for me and for my team, one of the things that was really important for us is that we didn't really feel like that addressed the clinical trial search as much. It's very granular. You have to know what you're looking for, and it's not necessarily that patient friendly. So we actually have our own tool, Antidote Match, and I can walk you really quick on how to access it from the US Pain Foundation website. But just to be clear, there's no real one right way to find a clinical trial. We just tried to make ours a little bit easier than that. So to access it, you're going to go underneath About Pain. You're going to click Clinical Research. And there's some great information on pain clinical trials. And so right here, you're going to see this Find a Clinical Trial widget. And that's from Antidote right here. And it's co-developed with the US Pain Foundation. And that's going to allow you to match the clinical trials in 60 seconds. That's if you search really quick. I like to take a little bit of time answering the question just to make sure I answer correctly. But you're going to get popped up to this screen where it's going to ask for what condition are you looking to find a clinical trial. So we're going to do migraine disorders. One of the things that's really helpful that we try to do is that we have this, for whom are you looking to find a clinical trial? We have 2 buttons here, myself, and that's going to be for anyone above the age of 13 can answer the myself journey. And if they're below the age of 13, or maybe, it's an older person or just someone else taking the screener on their behalf, you can click someone else. And so if you go with myself, that's going to be the verbiage of you. If you go with someone else, the verbiage is going to change to they. So we're going to look at where are they looking to find a clinical trial. So I'll put in my zip code. Oops. How far are they willing to travel? And this is really important here because this is going to be how close to you clinical trials are shown, whether it's all the way from 10 miles, 30 miles, 60 miles, 90 miles, or any. We're going to click any arbitrarily. How old are they? We'll do, let's say, 7 years old. What is their biological sex? Right now, that's we just have that because that's, like I said, what clinicaltrials.gov takes as an input, and we kind of liaise with them to pull the list of trials. So we're going to put male. This is something that we take a lot of pride in at Antidote, but is totally optional. There's a big skip button right here. And this is if you can't find a clinical trial, you can put your email in and we will email you when a matching clinical trial is found based on your answers. But totally optional, so I'm going to skip it. Now we're going to ask a race and ethnicity question. This is totally optional. As you can see right here, anything that you click skip on, you can skip. So this is where Antidote's experience, and we find it's much more patient friendly. We'll actually ask questions from the inclusion-exclusion criteria to try to inform results. So the first one is, do they currently experience migraines? You can see that there's a couple options here. I can click yes, I can click no, I can click I don't know, or I can just skip. I can skip any question. But for the sake of this, let's say yes. So now all of a sudden, it takes that and it goes, okay, well, of these 17 trials, do you have cluster headache syndrome? So for this, we said migraine, but this is where it's trying to kind of like we call it a pre-screener because we want to pre-screen patients for eligibility and make sure that they're actually qualified for the trial. So this is going to be asking a couple questions from some common inclusionary and exclusionary criteria. So we're going to say no. How much do they currently weigh? That's actually often a criteria in pediatric clinical trials. So we're gonna say, I don't know. They currently have tuberculosis. Might seem like a little bit of an absurd question, but that's actually one that appears a lot in clinical trials. Say no. They have HIV, no. They have Lyme disease. And this is all from these clinical trials, these 17 here. Our tool is actually pulling out those inclusion exclusion criteria and asking the most common ones. And then the last one, I believe, is, are they currently taking any opioids? Which the answer is no. And you're going to get a very similar kind of look. We like to think this is a little bit more patient friendly than clinicaltrials.gov. Like I've said, you can filter by the type of trial. You can filter by the phase. Trial alerts thing, once again, this is usually what find people fill it in when there's nothing here. Fortunately for me, for the purposes of this, there is a trial 0.1 miles away from me. And this is the same one on clinicaltrials.gov, but we really tried to separate this out to be a little bit more readable for people. And you can see right here, we took all these eligibility criteria and we condensed it into that screening one. Obviously, there's more that they're going to have to screen at the site, but in the base, this is a good fit for someone to go in and potentially at least explore the option if they have migraine. And so if someone were to participate, they can click choose this site, and then they can email themselves the study details as to where they're supposed to contact, as well as potentially the contact information of the contact at the site. So with that, I realize that I only left 10 minutes left. Apologies for that, but I'm happy to answer some questions right now.
Well, that was fantastic. And we have another question on here, and it says, is there any government authority or audit from NIH, et cetera, present to monitor the quality during any phase of the trials besides the actual trial team?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, I don't know the specific answer for this, but they are very involved, where, keep in mind, as part of this, the company has been in very close review with the FDA getting their protocol approved. So usually what goes into the development of these protocols is that the FDA has to approve of it, because the large goal for a lot of these trials, if they're going to get their drug or device or procedure approved, it has to be through the FDA. So usually a lot of these sponsors will be very close communication with them. And if the FDA has any concerns, they're very, very quick to kind of visit the sites or provide sort of a rebuke. And what the FDA can do is put something called a clinical hold, or a hold on the study. And so what a hold is if they find something that they don't like, whether it's the drug looks like it has some serious adverse effects, because keep in mind, the company has to continuously in real time provide the FDA with updates here. So if someone, let's say, had I'm trying to think of a very common one, not for pain trials, is liver damage. If a drug kind of hurts the liver or even raises the liver enzymes, sometimes the FDA can say, we're actually going to pause this trial until we get to the bottom of what's causing this. They can also do that if they find that maybe the quality of the investigational ingredient isn't up to snuff. And they will say, okay, well, we have to pause this to ensure the quality. So as part of that, there is sort of a continual real-time flow of information from the study team to the FDA. Hopefully that helps answer that question.
No, absolutely. And for some people who are on here who are maybe not as familiar, how common is it for clinical trials, medications and devices trials to go through the different phases? I mean, if things make it to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, to then go back to maybe phase 2, and then make it back to phase 3. I mean, is that
that's actually very common. I'd say, I wouldn't say, because usually, so let's say a drug is being investigated for migraine, right? And they find that maybe it doesn't work that well in this indication. Maybe they'll take that same molecule and they'll try for something else. So if they try it, as I mentioned before, that first line therapy. So maybe this isn't the best first line therapy, but maybe we'll try it in people who are treatment experienced or something like that. So now all of a sudden you have to go back. You can't just keep on riding on the consecutive phases.
okay?
And just to really go quick, is just as to how selective these processes are. First off, before a drug can even go in human trials, it has to pass the animal model, which a minority, I don't have the statistic, but if I recall correctly, it's like 10 to 20% of all drugs tested in animal models will go on to phase 1. Of those drugs, 70% will go on to phase 2. So now we're about 7% of all drugs. Of those drugs, about 30% will go on to phase 2. Sorry, 30% will go on to phase 3. That's like 2%. 30% of those will go on to approval. So that's like 0.5% of all molecules, 6%. That's why clinical trials are so important, because given how difficult getting a drug to approval is, it's so critical that these, clinical trials have enough people to actually determine whether or not they work.
Wow. Another question that just came in is, who is on the IRB for a study? Does a company select those members, or does FDA or somebody else?
That's a really good question. It's going to be different for every trial. There's actually, more often than not, what a lot of companies will do is they'll use what's called I might be using the wrong term here, but it's sort of like an external IRB that they'll actually contract with. And those IRBs are approved with the FDA. So each sponsor will individually contract with an IRB, and the IRB does have to be officially sort of registered with the FDA. So companies can't just fill the IRB with whoever they want. That's going to be a process that's sort of determined to make sure that the makeup of the IRB is actually ethical, and it's the ethics committee has to be ethically selected.
Okay. And then who decides if a drug moves on to the next phase? FDA for all stages?
That's also a really good question, because sometimes what will happen is a drug's result comes in and the FDA does have to decide whether or not it's going to accept the application for a phase 2. But sometimes if the drug doesn't work, a company might just say, maybe we're not going to invest our time or our effort in this molecule, and they'll actually cancel their own trials. But for a drug to move to the next trial, the FDA usually does have to be consulted, and the phase 2 has to be approved. And that's where it's clinicaltrials.gov is so key. I mean, every trial has to be registered with the NIH, with the FDA.
Okay. Thank you. Are clinical trials allowed to exclude from the results outliers, subject that doesn't respond to treatment in expected way? Such situations are in science research studies.
Usually that's a good point. I mean, usually what will happen is that given everyone that's responded, that's been selected by that inclusion exclusion trial, they'll try to focus on populations that found the biggest benefit from the treatment. But if they choose to do that, the drug won't be approved for the general population. It'll be approved for that specific subset that the FDA approved it on. So the FDA really decides, they get the data, and the FDA decides this is the approval you're going to get based on your data that you presented us with. So if they do exclude too many people, the FDA might also say, yeah, you're being way too specific with this. We're not interested.
Okay. Another question that came through is, how does consent and participation work with having young children participate in trials?
So yeah, I tried to touch on that before. Maybe I apologies if I didn't go into it enough, but a consent is usually 18 and up. You have to be able to consent. So what consent means is, you are able to fully understand that informed consent form, and you're really able to make the best decision in relationship to how you participate in clinical research. So you're fully aware of what happens, and you're able to do it. So just for example, a population that cannot consent, sometimes people with cognitive impairment or dementia, they're not allowed to consent. So they actually need someone to consent on their behalf, or they'll actually, it's a whole more complicated process when someone is a vulnerable population like that. So pediatric patients are a vulnerable population. So what usually will happen, and this is different by trial, of course, and this is all dependent on what the IRB comes up with, but more often than not, the caregiver, usually the parent or, just general caregiver, will do the consent. They'll consent into the study. And then the pediatric patient will have to assent, which means they don't need to understand everything that's going to happen, but it's a more simplified version of, are you willing to participate? And if they're, kicking and screaming that they don't want to, that's probably going to be not an assent. And I don't think they're allowed to give the drug in that case, because that pediatric patient has not received a cent. So that's what I believe happens. I mean, very different for all situations, but you can't just force someone into a clinical trial. I mean, there is that, I believe they call it informed assent. So it's sort of like a kid-friendly way that they're conducting the study. Or providing
Fantastic.
information.
Okay. So this is I'm gonna combine these two questions. So what do clinical trials cost a company? And then do patients get paid to participate? And who decides this, or is this up to the people running the trial?
So those are also really, really good questions. And I'm glad someone asked them, because I feel like everyone's always wondering that. So in regards to the first one, what companies pay for clinical trials, it's a lot of money. I mean, they have to spend the money on research and development of the molecule, which costs a lot of money. And if you think about that pass rate that I mentioned before for drugs, they're failing 98, 99% of the time. So that's all a sunk cost for them. They have to pay for all the people that work at the company. They have to pay the sites to participate. There's just basically anyone and everyone that's involved in a clinical trial. That's what the cost is. And so that's why it's often a very, very high price spend per clinical trial. And then in relation to the second one of, do patients get paid to participate? That's also very variable. Often, we don't see it that often for an interventional clinical trial. Usually the benefit of an interventional clinical trial is receiving the treatment for your condition. But more often than not, for a lot of observational clinical trials, patients will be paid for their time. And very important to realize as well that patients will very often be reimbursed for their travel or other expenses that come up as a result of participating in the clinical trial. And then in terms of who decides that trial, if how much patients get paid, that's IRB. Once again, IRB is trying to decide, is it ethical? Because paying patients to participate can be seen as a form of coercion. So coercing patients is something that IRBs will run away from. So it's all about just the right balance of making sure patients are participated but don't feel coerced. So short answer, IRB decides, and it's up to people running the study.
All right. So we've got two final questions here, because I know that this was supposed to be an hour, so we appreciate everybody staying on here. So the one of them is, do patients have legal obligation to stay through the whole study, or can they withdraw at any point for no particular reason?
Yes, patients can withdraw at any time throughout the study. That's part of the informed consent form. If you don't feel like the drug is doing, and life comes up, right? I mean, if you're not able to make the study visits, something comes up with work, or maybe a family emergency, you're not obligated to stay in the clinical trial. That's part of your rights being protected. They can't coerce you into staying in a treatment that you no longer want to be a part of.
All right, fantastic. And this one I actually feel like is a great one to kind of end on and wrap it up. And it is, why is it actually important to have clinical trials on pediatric patients versus just adult patients?
My favorite question.
That is for just the pediatric population instead of just focusing on adult patients.
So that's actually, yeah, no, that's my favorite question, because that's really where it all comes down to, is if a drug is only approved for adult patients, we don't really know how the drug works in pediatric patients. So what happens with that is, if you just say, well, and a child is a third of the size of an adult, let's just give a third of the dose. Well, what if kids respond to the medication twice as much? So now all of a sudden they're actually getting, the drug might be toxic or working too much, or vice versa. Maybe it's not working enough. So when you have that very niche population, it's very important to make sure that if there is a large proportion of pediatric patients taking a drug, you want to make sure that the drug works and that it's safe. I mean, I think for pediatric participants, the concern usually isn't efficacy. If it works in adults, it's probably going to work in kids. The concern is safety. I mean, if the dose is too big, you want to make sure that what is the right dose that we can treat kids with, that they're going to respond to it, have a response, but also, stay safe and not have serious side effects. And
Yes.
that's also something that's really big for a lot of these subgroups. I mean, as we mentioned before about the people that respond to treatments in very different ways, these clinical trials are really conducted to observe the effects in a very specific population. If you want to expand that to a bigger population, you have to do another clinical trial looking at that population you want to use your drug in.
Well, I can't thank you enough. Obviously, I mean, clinical trials are, we need them for children, pediatrics, we need them for adults, we need them for everybody. And so, I mean, you just were a wealth of information here for everybody, and it can be used, yes, for pediatrics and for adults. And so, I really can't thank you enough for helping to break down all of the information here for everybody who attended. And for everybody who joined us tonight, thank you so much for joining us and asking all of your questions. Sarah from Miles for Migraine and Susan from Champ and Migraine at School, thank you guys for joining. Richard from Antidote, thank you for your time and being here with us for September and Pain Awareness Month and this collaboration that we have. And for everybody else, this will be, well, this was recorded, and we will get this out to everybody. And we'll email this out to everybody. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your night. And thank you so much.
All right.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.